The Victorian era is one of the most overrepresented periods in historical cinema. Thanks to the popularity of Dracula, Sherlock Holmes, and Charles Dickens adaptations, we all have clear assumptions about what Victorian Britain looked like. Women in corsets and long skirts, men in top hats and stiff, high-collared shirts. Foggy evenings in London, a city populated by tragic orphans, repressed aristocrats, Oscar Wilde and Jack the Ripper. An era of tremendous technological advancement, coupled with absurdly conservative attitudes about class and sex. The popularity of Victorian fiction reinforces the belief that England was at the centre of the world, glossing over the British Empire's destructive genocidal impact overseas. But on the surface, Hollywood is more interested in the top hats and the corsets, using Victorian England as a kind of fantasy landscape. It's a fascinating period for cinematic costume design, because some movies can be painstakingly accurate, while others work with a totally fictionalised version of Victorian times, a setting that emerged from the melting pot of popular culture.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What?
Hi there, I'm Gavia Baker-Whitelaw, and this is Behind the Seams, decoding the world of costume design. Technically speaking, the Victorian era lasted from 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria. Fashion didn't evolve as fast in the 19th century as it does today, in a time of cheap, disposable, mass-produced clothing. But that's still a 64-year period involving significant innovation. There's no singular Victorian style that covers that whole time, not to mention the contrasts between people from different socio-economic backgrounds. But we do have some basic guidelines to work from. Men wore suits, while women wore long layered dresses or skirts, with corsets shaping their silhouette. Modesty was key, and there was no such thing as unisex fashion. Everyone wore hats outdoors. This was a matter of propriety, but certain styles of hat were a major part of fashion culture, like the obsession with massive, heavily decorated hats in the late 19th century. And since this was a period of industrial and economic upheaval, we also saw more mass-produced clothes than before. Victorian fiction displays more awareness about how these clothes were made, because this period saw a massive boom in factory work. North and South, an iconic Victorian novel, is all about class divides in an English cotton mill, where workers suffer from debilitating illnesses and low pay, milling cotton that may well have been picked by enslaved people overseas. But in the foreground, it's a romance about the mill owner falling in love with a middle-class woman. The main impact of the TV adaptation was to make Richard Armitage into an overnight sex symbol, with fans caring very little that his character beat his employees.
That can't be true.
Victorian movies often pay more attention to class divides than modern mainstream dramas. But at the same time, the historical setting allows us to view this period as a kind of fantasy, which can cause some problems down the line. If you want to depict an authentic view of Victorian life, you have plenty of documentary evidence to work from. Photography was invented in the 1820s and popularised by the 1850s. By the end of the 19th century, the first movies were being made. I can actually show you the oldest surviving film right now, but watch out, it's very short. Filmed in 1888, it's called the Roundhay Garden Scene and shows some English people in a garden. Real, live Victorians. By the 1890s, people were making films in the modern sense of the word. The first narrative movie was made by the prolific director Alice Guy Blaché, who also directed the first film with an all-black cast. We have plenty of footage of real Victorians portraying themselves on screen, either in realistic clothes or in fantastical stage costumes. Now, obviously this was all in black and white, which had a real impact on how modern audiences perceive the Victorian era. We think of the past in black and white, helped along by the fact that Queen Victoria was in mourning for much of her life, wearing a lot of black. The 19th century also saw the evolution of modern menswear, with men wearing tailored suits and ties, often in more subdued colours than earlier periods in Western history. Combine this with the Victorian propensity for gloomy, gothic fiction, and you have a recipe for Victorian historical dramas with a dark colour palette. But in reality, this period was more colourful than you think. Numerous portraits and fashion illustrations show women wearing colourful, wildly decorated gowns. That's why Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak features some of my favourite costumes from this era. The Muppet Christmas Carol is also a surprisingly authentic depiction of 19th century clothing through different periods of Scrooge's life, featuring plenty of colour. Comedies and children's movies are often more colourful than serious historical dramas. Plenty of Victorian clothes were garishly colourful. One particularly popular green dye created some literal fashion victims because it was made from arsenic and could seriously harm the wearer. So Victorian women had more to worry about than the discomfort of wearing a corset.
The corset, a symbol of repression to those who are forced to wear it.
Yes, it's finally time to talk about corsets. At some point, I may do a whole episode on this topic, but for now, a quick overview. After centuries of European women wearing some form of structured underwear, the Victorian corset is probably the most familiar today. It emphasised an hourglass figure with a narrow waist, extremely narrow in some cases. Tight lacing can be harmful, especially if you're pregnant or doing physical labour. But there's a lot of debate over how dangerous corsets actually were to the general population. Most working class women weren't wearing painfully rigid, narrow-waisted corsets, in the same way that most women today aren't dressing and dieting like Kim Kardashian. Women's silhouettes evolved a lot over the Victorian era, although the narrow waist was a recurring theme. You'd wear a corset on top of an undershirt with your dress or skirt over the top. This was bulked up by underskirts or flexible frameworks known as crinolines, which created a structured silhouette. There was a lot of debate and controversy over corsetry at the time. People raised health concerns about tight lacing. Some men criticised women for their supposed vanity, while others openly praised them for achieving narrow waists. And in the latter half of the century, people introduced alternatives like the Liberty bodice, designed to give women more physical freedom. These clashing opinions will surely feel familiar to anyone who notices the way women's appearances are debated and criticised today. But for the most part, this kind of historical detail doesn't appear in Victorian movies. Corsets are depicted in a very simplistic light, either as a fetish object or as a symbol of women's oppression, or both. As a rigid, restrictive garment that tightly contains a woman's body while also being kind of sexy, it's a perfect metaphor for how we view Victorian gender roles and sexuality. But why are we so fascinated by Victoriana? It's partly a matter of volume. We're exposed to lots of Victorian historical dramas, so it's a familiar genre. The 19th century was also a foundational period for certain modes of storytelling that remain popular today, like Gothic fiction, sci-fi, and detective stories. But I think a big part of our Victorian obsession is down to cultural values.
Don't stop.
I think you're enjoying yourself too much.
The 19th century is long enough ago that it feels like history. But unlike the more distant past, Victorian life feels somewhat similar to our own. This period brought technological advances that led to the way we live our lives today. And Victorian politics are relatively easy to map onto modern values. 19th century racism, sexism, and class divides set the scene for 20th century political movements that we can easily understand today. In fact, when we think of old-fashioned conservative values, we're often talking about ideas that were established by the Victorians, like the criminalisation of homosexuality. Earlier periods of British history were arguably less conservative by modern standards. In other words, our fictionalised view of Victorian Britain has a major impact on people's view of what history looked like. And thanks to the popularity of children's books like Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, and The Secret Garden, some people actually feel a kind of nostalgia for Victorian times, even if none of us experienced it firsthand. Mainstream audiences are exposed to more Victorian media than stories set in, say, the 14th century. That means we're comparatively well informed, but it also means we develop a lot of assumptions, like our stereotypes about Victorian gloom or prudish 19th century attitudes to sex.
Well, if you'll excuse me.
Suit yourself.
In turn, this combination of real knowledge and popular misconception feeds into our more fantastical images of Victorian Britain, like the steampunk genre. Steampunk has been around since the 1980s, but reached its pop culture peak around 2010. It's a subgenre of Victorian sci-fi and fantasy, defined by clockwork and steam-powered imagery, and a playfully ahistorical approach to 19th century fashion. The steampunk aesthetic evolved through novels, role-playing games, fandom and cosplay, but there's no definitive movie in the way that Blade Runner exemplifies cyberpunk. However, plenty of mainstream media includes elements of steampunk, like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen or the Amazon fantasy series Carnival Row. These stories treat Victorian Britain as a kind of playground, adopting familiar tropes and images while often divorcing them from meaningful socio-political context. Needless to say, I have mixed feelings on this. Hollywood wants to keep the corsets and top hats, banking on the franchise potential for beloved stories like Sherlock Holmes and Peter Pan. But this invariably plays into British colonial propaganda, prioritising a fairy tale image of 19th century Britain. That's how we end up with god-awful blockbusters like Dr. Dolittle, and clunky prestige dramas like The Aeronauts, which invented an ahistorical female empowerment story about a non-existent female hot air balloonist. So while I do enjoy plenty of Victorian dramas, it often feels like the genre is dominated by shallow assumptions rather than interesting insights into the era. On the whole, I'd love to see more thoughtful Victorian movies like 2017's Lady Macbeth or 2020's David Copperfield. Or to see Hollywood look further afield for new historical dramas. Thanks so much for watching Behind the Seams. What historical period deserves more Hollywood movies? Let me know in the comments section below. I take time to read everyone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.